talk to them? What not? Damn, it's the police! Here he comes, here he comes, here he comes!
At 2:06 a.m., just east of the Folsom County line, Officer Drew Hale was running routine patrol along a stretch of highway that stayed mostly empty at that hour. Visibility was decent, the roads were dry, and the traffic lights were blinking yellow through intersections that hadn't seen a car in minutes. Up ahead, he noticed a black Nissan Altima veering slightly across the white line before correcting again and drifting slowly toward the left without using a signal. It wasn't aggressive or erratic, more like someone distracted or struggling to stay alert. Hale followed for a little while, watching. The car wasn't speeding, and it wasn't weaving sharply, but the repeated lane drift was enough to justify a stop. When it crossed fully into the opposite lane, even with no oncoming traffic, he activated his lights. The vehicle slowed down without hesitation and pulled off near a gravel patch where the shoulder widened. It came to a stop without slamming the brakes or overcorrecting, just a controlled deceleration and idle, like someone who had done this before or didn't think they had anything to worry about. When Hale walked up to the driver's side, he saw a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, sitting calmly with both hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't appear surprised. His eyes tracked Hale without hesitation, and when asked where he was headed, he said he was coming back from a friend's place and was just trying to get home and sleep. There was no smell of alcohol, no slurred speech, no struggle to find his license. His responses were clear and his hands didn't shake when he passed over the registration. Everything on the documents matched. Hale decided to go through the field sobriety test just to be thorough. The man followed the pen without breaking eye contact, walked heel to toe in a straight line without stumbling, and stood still with no visible sway. Nothing in his behavior raised a flag. He didn't act irritated or impatient, just steady and quiet. But then Hale noticed something else. On the man's left sleeve, just beneath the cuff, there was a faint, dry stain. The color was reddish-brown, barely visible under normal lighting, but it caught Hale's eye under the beam of his flashlight. It looked like dried blood, not recent, but enough to be obvious at close range. When Hale asked about it, the man looked down at the sleeve, then back at Hale, and said, "It's not mine." He didn't explain, didn't offer a follow-up, and didn't seem worried. He just sat there with his hands still on the wheel. That was enough for Hale to request backup. It wasn't an arrest, and there was no reason to escalate. Not yet. But something about the stop, even with how normal it looked on paper, didn't feel like something he should walk away from. Backup arrived within 8 minutes. One county deputy and another unit from Hale's department. Nothing about the situation felt urgent on the surface, but Hale flagged them down quietly and explained the reason for the extra eyes. The driver hadn't moved. His car was still running, hands still visible, posture unchanged. When asked again about the stain, he repeated what he'd said earlier, that it wasn't his. They asked where he'd been that night, and he said he had stopped by a friend's place for a late dinner. He didn't name the friend, didn't specify an address, and when pressed for the location, he said he couldn't remember the exact street because he had been driving around aimlessly afterward to clear his head. His tone didn't shift, no panic, no deflection, just that same flat, cooperative calm that made it difficult to pin anything on him. The stain on the shirt wasn't large, no fresh smear, no soaked fabric, just a crusted patch near the cuff and a smaller dot closer to the elbow. It looked old, not more than a day, but not from that night either. There were no other visible signs, no cuts, no bandages, no blood on his hands or under his fingernails. Nothing to indicate he was hurt. When asked if anyone in the car had been injured recently, he said no one else had been inside. They checked the back seat and the trunk. Nothing out of place. No trace evidence that stood out. The interior smelled like fast food wrappers and fabric cleaner. The Bodycam footage would later show Hale looking into the car again, lingering just slightly longer than protocol demanded, as if waiting for something to click, but it didn't. There wasn't enough to arrest him. He hadn't failed the test. His story had holes, but nothing substantial enough to hold him on. Still, Hale wrote down the license plate and made sure dispatch logged the name, time, and location with a supplemental note about the dried blood. The man was allowed to leave, and he did, slowly, signal on, pulling back onto the highway like it had all been routine. It would have stayed that way too, except for what showed up 2 counties over less than 12 hours later. At 6:42 the next morning, a maintenance crew called in a report from a small state-run campground just across the county line. One of the workers had been clearing debris near the creek trail and noticed something caught against the base of a bridge piling, dark fabric, tangled in roots and stones. At first, they assumed it was discarded clothing or trash from one of the campsites. Then they saw the hair. The responding deputy confirmed it was a body, female, no ID, clothes soaked through and partly torn. There were signs she'd been dragged or rolled, her shoes were missing, and the backs of her hands had scripts consistent with gravel or concrete. No wallet, no phone, no bag nearby. The coroner placed time of death at somewhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., with cause undetermined pending toxicology. There were no visible stat wounds or gunshots, just a small bruise near the base of the skull and another, faint one along the side of her neck. Nothing that immediately screamed homicide, but nothing that looked accidental either. It wasn't a spot where people usually swam, and even during heavy rains, the creek never got strong enough to pull someone under. There had been no storms, no flooding, no obvious reason for a body to drift down that far unless it was placed there. When they dusted for tire tracks, they found one set, faint, partially washed by morning dew, heading in and out along the gravel access road. No clear tread match, just proof that someone had come close enough to the drop zone sometime in the past few hours. The case was still marked as unknown cause, but the flag went out to surrounding agencies in case anything turned up that might connect. Hale didn't get the notification until after lunch, when his dispatcher mentioned it during a lull between calls. Just a heads up, they said. It's probably nothing. Just proximity. He read the memo twice, then pulled up the time log from the night before. His stop had been just 26 miles from the drop site. Different counties, different departments, but not different enough. Detective Elena Torres got the call just before 3:00 p.m. Her unit had been flagged because the location of the body, a shallow bend along Wren Creek, fell within an old missing persons radius from an unsolved case 2 months back. A 17-year-old girl named Tessa Miles had disappeared from a different town about 40 minutes east. No matches yet, but the file hadn't been closed. Torres drove to the scene that afternoon. The body had already been removed, but the area remained cordoned off with yellow tape. She walked the trail slowly, eyes tracing the waterline, then stood at the foot of the bridge and looked upstream. The ground was soft, not muddy, but it showed slight compression in 2 places. Not footprints exactly, but enough to tell her someone had been kneeling or crouched there for a while. Maybe to drag, maybe to position. Either way, it wasn't where someone would have fallen naturally. She asked about surrounding surveillance, but the closest working camera was 2 miles out at a ranger station with no overnight feed. The rest of the trail system had no active monitoring. Whoever left her there knew the blind spots. Torres called for photos of the tire marks and flagged them for comparison with any local towing records, patrol logs, or delivery runs in the area from the night before. Back at the precinct, she requested copies of all field stops logged during the same time frame, and that's when she noticed the 2:31 a.m. entry from County 12. A DUI check, no arrest made, just a routine stop. Male, mid-20s, name, Brandon Kessler. The notes were sparse, but something stuck out. The vehicle description said dark gray hatchback with a dent in the front passenger side fender. Torres pulled up photos from the creek. One of the debris shots showed a faint scuff on the edge of a broken guardrail, small, low to the ground, the kind that matched the height of a bumper. No paint transfer, but the angle seemed right. She logged the license plate from the field report and ran it through the DMV. The address was local, about 18 miles from the drop site. No priors, no missing persons connections, but now, at least, she had a name. Brandon Kessler's initial stop didn't raise any alarms. Officer Kyle Bennett had pulled him over just after 2:30 a.m. for a soft drift over the lane divider. It wasn't reckless, but enough to warrant a check. Bennett activated his dash cam as he approached the car. Kessler kept both hands on the wheel, rolled down the window immediately, and answered every question without hesitation. His breath didn't smell like alcohol, and there was no visible impairment. Still, Bennett ran him through a field sobriety test. Straight line walk, one leg stand, horizontal gaze. Kessler passed each one without issue. He explained that he'd been coming from a coworker's birthday in Bellevue and had taken a wrong exit trying to avoid late-night traffic on the main highway. His license was clean. Registration matched. Insurance was up to date. There was no mess inside the car, no signs of drug use or anything illegal. Bennett noted a faint smudge on Kessler's sleeve, something reddish near the elbow, but it looked old, maybe from earlier in the day. Kessler said he'd helped his friend move a broken shelf that afternoon and must have scraped something. The officer didn't press further. There was no cause to escalate, and nothing in Kessler's demeanor suggested nervousness or evasion. The interaction lasted 6 minutes. Bennett filed the traffic warning, told him to drive safe, and returned to his cruiser. By department standards, it was routine. No flags, no notes added. But when Detective Torres reviewed the footage a day later, one detail stood out. Kessler never asked why he'd been pulled over. Not once. From the moment the window came down, he just followed instructions. It wasn't proof of anything. Just unusual. At 3:17 a.m., just 45 minutes after Officer Bennett let him go, Brandon Kessler pulled into a Sinclair gas station on Route 19. The cameras picked up his sit-in as it rolled slowly past Pump 3, then eased into a spot near the edge of the lot, away from the lights, close to the dumpsters. There was no one else visible in the frame. The footage showed Kessler stepping out, walking toward the convenience store, then stopping halfway. He looked at the door, checked his phone, and turned around. No transaction. No fuel. No interaction with staff. He got back in and sat motionless behind the wheel for just under 5 minutes. When he pulled out again, the car moved even slower than before. He circled the lot once more, then exited toward the south side of the highway, opposite the direction he said he was headed during the stop. None of it was criminal, just odd. Detectives went through the security footage frame by frame. No one else entered the lot during those 6 minutes. No other vehicles followed or left with him. The timestamp matched what was already logged from traffic cams 2 miles down. And yet, the seatbelt camera inside the store's ATM, an angle rarely checked, showed something faint on his shirt as he turned back toward his car. A darker patch, smeared left to right across his chest, low enough to miss from a cruiser's headlight beam. It hadn't been there during the sobriety test. Brandon's official timeline had a gap between 3 o'clock and 4:10 a.m. He said he pulled off the road near an abandoned lot to take a call, and then sat there for a while, trying to calm down. He didn't say from what, just that he'd needed space. Cell tower pings confirmed his phone had stayed in the area, near County Road 12, close to a dirt access road that hadn't been used in months. Officers went out that morning, just after sunrise. The ground was still soft from the night's humidity, and the cruiser tires left tracks of their own. No fresh skid marks, no signs of struggle, just trash, dry weeds, and one discarded hoodie. It was black, thin, rolled into a loose knot, and tossed halfway into a drainage ditch. Inside the pocket was a small name tag sticker, mostly faded, with the letters "Heyday" still visible in blue marker. It looked like something a kid might wear on a school field trip. Brandon said he didn't know anything about it. He said he never left the car, that maybe someone else had been in the area. But the hoodie had a single smear of blood along the right sleeve, same pattern, same partial DNA profile as the one from his shirt. It wasn't enough for charges, but it shifted the focus. Detectives no longer treated it like a routine follow-up. The blood on Brandon's shirt and the smear on the hoodie both traced back to a juvenile DNA profile logged during a prior CPS intake, a 13-year-old girl named Haley Quinn. She'd gone into the system 2 years earlier after an anonymous report flagged her home as unfit. There were no criminal charges, but CPS had records, signs of neglect, multiple missed school days, a withdrawn demeanor. She'd been moved between temporary homes, foster placements, then group housing. Her file showed she'd last checked in at a short-term care facility in Morrington. That facility reported her missing 5 days ago. No sign of forced exit. No note. Just gone. At the time, no Amber Alert had gone out. She was marked as a voluntary runaway, which meant minimal follow-up. Just a BOO. No active search. Now she was the blood source on Brandon's shirt, and the girl whose name was half visible in the hoodie. Locke looked back through every mention of Brandon's night, every place he claimed to stop, every camera feed he passed. Haley never appeared. Her last confirmed sighting was a security check at 11:41 p.m., caught walking through a hallway in worn jeans and that same black hoodie. She didn't look scared, just tired. No one saw her after that. No one reported seeing Brandon with a girl. And when asked again, directly, Brandon repeated the same thing. He said he'd been alone the whole night. At 2:12 a.m., a security camera at the BP off County Line Road caught Brandon's van pulling in. He didn't park at the pump, just idled near the side of the lot for a few seconds, then rolled forward and stopped out of frame. Inside, the overnight clerk was restocking bottled water. He didn't notice the van at first, but about 2 minutes later, Brandon came in, alone. He didn't look nervous, just distracted. The clerk remembered him asking if they had a public bathroom. When told it was out of order, Brandon nodded and walked out without buying anything. The entire interaction took less than 30 seconds. But what stood out was what happened next. Roughly a minute later, the clerk heard the trash bin outside rattle. When he looked up, he saw Brandon at the side of the van again, this time with the passenger door open. He was wiping something off the dashboard with what looked like a cloth or shirt. Then he leaned in, tossed something behind the seat, and shut the door. The van pulled away, slowly, without tires squealing or headlights flaring. The footage wasn't clear enough to read plates, but the timestamp matched, and the trash bin. It hadn't been emptied since that morning. Inside it, officers later found a torn piece of denim and part of a shoelace, both speckled with dried blood. At 3:06 a.m., Officer Riley spotted the van again, parked along a service road near the woods, about 4 miles from the gas station. The engine was off, headlights cold. He approached cautiously, called it in as a welfare check. Backup was still 10 minutes out. The windows were fogged over. Nothing moved inside. Riley knocked twice, waited, then circled toward the back. That's when he noticed the faint scrape marks on the dirt, like the van had backed in, then adjusted once. He called out, and Brandon answered from the driver's seat, said he pulled over to sleep. His voice was calm, cooperative. Riley asked for ID. Brandon handed it over without hesitation. He didn't seem nervous, just tired. Then Riley glanced at the rear door. The handle looked scratched up, not fresh, but worn. He asked if there was anything in the trunk. Brandon said no, just tools and an old blanket. When backup arrived, they opened it anyway. There were tools, there was a blanket, and beneath it, a pair of shoes, kid's size. Tucked beside them was a school backpack. Inside, a juice box, some snack wrappers, and a drawing. Crayons on torn paper, something that looked like a house, and 2 stick figures holding hands. Brandon didn't move when they found it. He just sat quietly in the front seat, staring at the windshield like none of this was new. At 6:18 p.m., Detective Laramie returned to the initial impound report. The Camry had been processed twice, once by the towing contractor and again by the forensics team, but something wasn't lining up. According to the tow sheet, there were 3 items removed from the front passenger seat: an empty fast food bag, a hoodie, and a phone charger. But in the log filed by forensics later that afternoon, the hoodie wasn't mentioned at all. The fast food bag and charger were listed, but there was no entry for any clothing item. Laramie contacted the tow yard. The manager on shift didn't remember the item personally, but said if it had been listed on the initial sheet, it should have been handed over. The officer who signed the sheet had already rotated off duty for the weekend. A search of the evidence locker came up clean. No hoodie logged, no photographs of it. The interior shots from the vehicle showed something bunched up on the seat, but the angle wasn't clear enough to confirm color or type. It wasn't a major piece of evidence on its own, but it stood out now, especially after the lab results on the shirt came back. The blood on the Camry driver's shirt didn't match his own. It was female. O positive, and it hadn't fully soaked through, suggesting it had transferred from surface contact, not direct bleeding. Laramie flagged it, not as proof, but as a loose thread. If the hoodie was gone, the question was when, before the stop, during impound, or sometime after. Either way, it wasn't in evidence anymore. At 10:41 a.m., the precinct received a follow-up from a records technician cross-referencing 911 logs. A call had come in from a payphone near Interstate 40 at 4:57 a.m. on the same night as the Camry stop. The location was less than 2 miles from where the vehicle was first spotted drifting across lanes. The caller didn't leave a name. The dispatch transcript showed only 38 seconds of audio. A female voice, nervous, quiet, said she was hiding from someone and needed a ride. Before the operator could get a callback number or send units, the line cut off. No units had been dispatched. The operator tried to redial, but payphones couldn't receive incoming calls. The incident had been marked as non-actionable due to lack of location detail and closed an hour later. Laramie had the audio pulled and cleaned. It wasn't crystal clear, but there were faint background noises, traffic hum, a metallic clank, maybe from a nearby lot gate or dumpster lid. At the tail end of the call, just before it cut out, something else came through. A voice in the distance, male, not loud, not yelling, said something that could have been, "Where'd you go?" or "Hey, wait." No one had followed up on it at the time. The call hadn't matched any open cases, and the number hadn't connected to anything traceable. Now, it was added to the file, not as confirmation, but as another thing they hadn't seen when it would have mattered. Later that afternoon, a tech from the crime lab called in with a preliminary result. The blood on the man's shirt wasn't his, which had already been expected. What wasn't expected was how little there was. The smear across the lower chest tested positive as human, female, and fresh. No more than a few hours old at the time of collection. But it was only on the outer layer. Nothing had seeped through. No secondary stains on the undershirt. No signs that it had dripped, splattered, or come from close-range trauma. It looked more like transfer. A single pass. Possibly from contact with another person's clothing or skin. The smear had a downward drag, as if wiped or brushed against. The lab hadn't yet matched the DNA. The system was backlogged. They'd flagged it as priority, but turnaround could still take days. Until then, there was nothing in the system that could identify the source. Laramie requested the rest of the clothing from evidence. The shoes were clean. No visible trace of blood, dirt, or fluid. The jeans had minor scuffs at the knees, but no consistent marks. Only the shirt, the most visible part, told any kind of story, and even that one didn't line up. They brought the man back in for a second round of questions. This time, he didn't ask for a lawyer. He said he'd already answered everything and wasn't sure why they kept asking. When they showed him the photo of his shirt, he didn't react. He just said he didn't know where the blood came from. He said he hadn't touched anyone. He didn't know anyone was hurt. And then he said he'd just been walking, trying to get home, nothing else. At 2:38 a.m., CCTV footage from a gas station 6 blocks north of the original stop showed the man walking southbound. The timestamp matched his statement. He had no vehicle and seemed to be alone. He moved at a steady pace, head low, hands in the hoodie pocket. No one followed. No one approached. Nothing in his path looked unusual. The next sighting was at 3:06 a.m., caught by a residential camera on a quiet side street. He had changed direction slightly but was still walking, now eastward, and the blood on his shirt wasn't yet visible. The resolution was too low to say for sure, but the fabric looked clean. There was a 30-minute gap between that clip and when the officers encountered him. Somewhere in that window, something changed. The street between those 2 points didn't have commercial surveillance. A few homes had doorbell cams, but most were offline or angled too high. One system had caught headlights but no pedestrian movement. Another picked up audio, distant footsteps, and a dog barking, but no visuals. Laramie and the techs mapped the route again. If he had made a detour, it wasn't long. The distance didn't allow for more than 10 or 15 minutes off course. They checked alleyways, garages, trash bins. Nothing came up. No signs of confrontation. No trail. Just a man walking into a gap and coming out different. The theory at the time was that he had brushed against someone in distress. Maybe helped without realizing the severity. Maybe didn't stay long enough to understand what happened. But that idea didn't hold. No one else had reported an incident. No calls to 911. No missing person matching the blood type. No witness placing anyone else on the street. They had his route before. They had his route after. What they didn't have was the moment in between, the only one that might have mattered. By 7:45 a.m., the shirt had been processed and cataloged. It was a plain black cotton crew neck. No visible damage, no embedded fibers, no tears along the seams or sleeves. The blood was smeared more than splattered, as if transferred by contact rather than projected. It had dried unevenly, with darker crusts along the lower right front and lighter streaks reaching toward the collar. Testing confirmed it wasn't his. The blood type was B positive. His own was O negative. That alone didn't prove much, but it made one thing clear. The man had been in contact with someone else who was bleeding. There were no fingerprints on the fabric aside from his own. No skin cells. No hair. No signs of vomit, saliva, or other biological cross-contamination. Whoever the source was, they had bled onto the shirt without leaving much else behind. Laramie had the forensics tech walk him through the lab notes again. The edges of the stain weren't consistent with a direct injury to the wearer. There was no pattern suggesting soaking from the inside. Instead, it looked like the shirt had been pressed against a wounded area, chest height, based on the curve of the transfer. So the question shifted. If he didn't hurt anyone, why did someone injured come that close to him? And if it wasn't during the walk, not on the gas station footage, not on any nearby cameras, then where exactly did it happen? They logged the blood as evidence under its own ID and flagged the DNA for a missing persons cross-check. But without a body, without a report, and without a scene, it was just a sample. Just part of a puzzle no one could even confirm existed. The man was still sitting in holding. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked to leave. He just kept saying the same thing, that he didn't know where the blood came from, and that if someone got hurt, it wasn't because of him. At 8:12 a.m., Officer Brenner circled back to the AMCO station off Route 83, the one from the earlier footage. The clerk was still on shift, same man from the Bodycam, now more awake, with a half-empty thermos behind the register. He remembered the guy in the black shirt, said he came in just before 5 o'clock, walked around a bit, didn't buy anything, and didn't seem drunk or aggressive. When asked if the man had spoken to anyone, the clerk shook his head. There were no customers inside at that time, just one sit-in at the pump that pulled away after a minute. No interaction, no argument, nothing that stood out. Brenner asked about the security feed again. The clerk confirmed it was continuous loop, stored off-site. He couldn't scrub or export without the manager's credentials. That would take hours, maybe until late afternoon. Still, they replayed the front camera. The man was visible entering and exiting. In both clips, the shirt looked clean. The angle wasn't ideal, but it showed enough. No visible bloodstain, no dragging or wiping motions. It looked like an ordinary visit. That narrowed the window. If the shirt was clean when he went inside, and stained when he was stopped 20 minutes later, something had happened in between. But the walking path was quiet, with no reported incidents, no witnesses, no other flagged 911 calls from that stretch of road. Brenner asked if the clerk had seen anything on his smoke break, cars parked out front, anyone circling. He shook his head again, said the only weird part was how calm the guy had seemed. Just slow steps, looking around like he didn't know where he was supposed to be. They left the station with no new leads, just confirmation of what hadn't happened. He hadn't attacked anyone inside. He hadn't arrived covered in blood. So wherever the shirt got stained, it wasn't here, and it probably wasn't on camera. By 9:25 a.m., the man had been sitting in interview room 3 for over an hour. He wasn't restrained, but the chair didn't allow for much movement. His hands were still on the table, fingers relaxed, one wrist wrapped in a makeshift gauze. It hadn't been bandaged earlier, so someone must have done it at the hospital or just before transport. Detective Hill stepped in first. Clipboard, pen, no recorder yet. He started casually, asked about the wrist. The man looked down and said he must have scraped it on something near the guardrail when he sat down. He didn't seem sure, and the phrasing was off, like he was repeating something someone had told him. Hill nodded and asked if it bled much. The man said not really, just enough to notice, said it stopped on its own. But the gauze was new, clean, white, not something you'd expect from a roadside wrap job. They made a note to check if EMS had logged any treatment for it. They hadn't, as far as anyone remembered. 10 minutes in, the man still hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked why he was being held. Every answer he gave was soft, almost too agreeable. No pushback, no confusion, no visible signs of fear or urgency. Detective Marsh entered a few minutes later and took a seat across from him. She asked if he knew why the officers had stopped him that morning. He said it was because he had crossed the line while walking. She nodded but didn't respond, just let the silence drag for a beat. Then she asked about the blood on the shirt. The man paused for the first time. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, then said he didn't know. He said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. Marsh asked again, more directly this time, whether he had been in a fight or come across someone injured. The man shook his head and said no, nothing like that. Hill asked about the walk from the gas station. The man said he didn't remember every step, but didn't see or talk to anyone. They asked again if he had passed a vehicle, maybe someone calling for help. Again, he said no. It was like trying to get traction on glass. The man wasn't evasive, but he wasn't helpful. Just calm, still, and consistent. And that was starting to bother them more than if he had panicked. By the time officers returned to the area where he was found, the sun was fully up. The road was dry, traffic light, and the surrounding slope quiet except for distant morning birds and the occasional car passing by. They marked the location near the guardrail, where the man said he rested and started working outward from there. No crowds had gathered, no yellow tape. Just 2 patrol vehicles parked on the shoulder and 3 officers combing through the brush with gloves and flashlights, though it was broad daylight. About 20 feet down the incline, one of them found a small blood smear on a flat rock. It had partially dried, but hadn't yet flaked or faded. There was no broken glass, no drag marks, and no sign of a larger struggle, just the smear and a few disturbed leaves. They flagged it and kept looking. Farther downhill, a cracked phone screen was half buried in the dirt. It wasn't unlocked, but the wallpaper showed a girl's face, maybe 16 or 17. She was smiling at the camera, no filter, just a seatbelt strap running across her shoulder. It didn't match any ID found on the man. They bagged it and checked the immediate area, but there was no purse, backpack, or other items. Just the phone, lying close to a faint footprint that wasn't fresh, but hadn't been washed away either. The slope flattened toward a dry ditch where someone could have fallen, or been left, without being seen from the road. But they didn't find anything else there. No clothing, no blood trail, nothing to suggest someone had crawled or been dragged. When they made it back up to the roadside, one of the officers noted that if someone had walked up from that spot in the dark, they would have ended up right where the man had been standing. And if they had been with someone else, it was possible that person had never made it back up. At 10:37 a.m., a technician pulled the call log from the recovered phone. Most of the recent activity was typical. Short calls to friends, some unanswered spam numbers, a few texts back and forth with a saved contact labeled Mom. Nothing stood out until they saw a missed call at 3:04 a.m., just minutes before the man was stopped. The call had gone out to a number not saved in the phone, a local area code, no name. It rang once and disconnected. The team traced it to a prepaid line purchased from a corner gas station about 6 weeks earlier. No ID had been used to activate it. The card had since gone cold. No activity, no response to texts or follow-ups. They couldn't be sure who owned it, and it wasn't registered to the man in custody. They asked him again. He said he didn't recognize the number and hadn't used the phone. When shown the wallpaper, he paused for a second before saying it wasn't anyone he knew. He said he found the phone near the ditch and thought about turning it in, but forgot once the cops showed up. They asked why he hadn't mentioned it earlier. He shrugged and said he figured it wasn't important. Back at the station, detectives pulled surrounding surveillance. Nearby drive-through windows, ATMs, traffic cameras. One caught something. At 2:59 a.m., a sedan pulled into the far end of a rest-stop parking lot, about 3 miles from the stop location. It didn't park near the building or lights, just coasted along the edge, headlights off, and paused for almost a minute. The footage was low resolution, no plate, no clear make or model, but a shape moved near the passenger side, possibly a door opening or someone stepping out. By the time officers arrived at that lot, the area had already been cleaned, trash collected, no vehicle in sight, no cameras pointing close enough to catch anything useful. They saved the clip and marked the location. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the only camera showing a car active in that window, and it pointed towards someone else possibly being with him that night. By midday, the department had logged over a dozen calls from local reporters asking if the arrest was related to a missing persons case. The department gave no comment, only confirming that the individual had been detained and the matter was still under investigation. In the meantime, officers ran checks through nearby hospitals, shelters, and emergency clinics. No one had come in with injuries matching the blood type on the shirt. No ambulance had been dispatched to that stretch of road. Nothing about the night matched any active incident report. They pushed the data wider. State agencies, neighboring counties, even missing persons entries from the past 72 hours. Still nothing connected. One of the younger officers asked whether it was possible that no one had reported her missing. It was a fair question. Not everyone gets reported, and not everyone has someone who's looking. The lab team had sent the blood sample to the regional DNA database, but that would take time. Days, maybe longer. The man remained calm during the second round of questioning. He stuck to his statement, said he hadn't hurt anyone, said he didn't know who the blood belonged to, said he was just trying to get home after helping a friend fix a flat tire. They asked for the friend's name. He didn't give one. He said it wasn't someone close, just a guy he ran into earlier that night. The story didn't move forward, and neither did the case. With no victim, no ID, and no formal complaint, there was technically no crime on record. For now, they couldn't charge him with anything. Later that evening, a resident from 3 blocks away came forward with something small, but potentially useful. They'd been reviewing old outdoor footage on a motion-activated camera, mostly looking for raccoons getting into their trash again, when they noticed a vehicle rolling slowly past the house at around 1:42 a.m. It was the same white sedan. The footage was grainy, and the streetlight overhead flickered too much to make out who was inside. The car didn't stop or speed up. It just passed by quietly, following the curb like it was driving cautiously through a familiar area. The timing matched what the man had said, that he was driving through the neighborhood after helping someone nearby. Officers reviewed the clip several times, trying to pick out anything odd. There was no visible damage on the car, no other person in the frame, just the quiet, low-speed pass. They checked the location against known addresses, looking for anything that would connect the man to someone nearby. No records came up, no traffic stops, no previous calls to that address, no known associates within those blocks. It wasn't enough to confirm or disprove anything, but it kept the case moving, even if only slightly. At the very least, it confirmed that part of his route was real, or at least plausible. Still, the blood on his shirt remained unaccounted for, and the database hadn't returned a match. The man returned to the station the next morning after receiving a follow-up request. He came alone, wearing the same jacket from the night before, though this time it was zipped all the way up. He looked tired but not nervous, more like someone who hadn't slept well but was still trying to cooperate. The officer asked if he was willing to clarify a few things, and he nodded. They walked him through the timeline again, piece by piece. He repeated most of it word for word, like he'd gone over it in his head several times. But one thing had changed. This time, when asked where he dropped the girl off, he gave a slightly different intersection, Not far, just 1 block east of what he'd said earlier, but enough to catch attention. When pressed on the change, he hesitated, then said he might have gotten turned around. He said it was dark. He wasn't familiar with the area. He just remembered pulling over near a stop sign. There was no immediate reason to assume he was lying, but the inconsistency stood out. Officers noted the change and flagged it for follow-up. They didn't accuse him of anything, and the conversation continued without confrontation. When they wrapped up, he asked if there was anything else they needed from him. The officers said they'd be in touch and walked him out. He left quietly, again without a lawyer, again without asking many questions. Back at the desk, the shift supervisor reviewed both statements. On paper, they were nearly identical, except for that small shift in location. Just 1 block. But sometimes, 1 block makes a difference. Later that day, 2 plainclothes officers drove out to the new intersection the man had mentioned. The spot didn't look much different from the one he gave the night before. Same kind of street, same kind of houses. But they scanned the area anyway. There were no cameras pointing directly at the curb. No stores or homes with obvious views. But about halfway down the block, they noticed something. A set of tire marks near a storm drain. Fresh enough to still show depth in the gravel, but not deep enough to prove anything on their own. They followed the marks until they faded into a side street. There was nothing else obvious nearby. No blood. No clothing. No drag marks. Just a subtle groove in the loose gravel, the kind of thing that wouldn't mean much unless you were already looking for it. One of the officers walked a few yards into the grass lining the sidewalk. It had been recently trimmed, but toward the fence, he spotted something stuck near the base of a post. A torn piece of white fabric, about the size of a glove, stained on one end. They didn't touch it. Instead, they called it in and waited for crime scene to log it. While they stood there, a neighbor across the street came out to water her plants. She watched for a moment, then walked over and asked if something had happened. The officer kept it vague, just routine follow-up. But before they could move on, she said she remembered seeing a car parked there a couple nights ago. It wasn't familiar. Black, maybe, didn't stay long. She didn't remember the license plate, didn't see who was inside. But she said she noticed it because it was late, and she couldn't sleep. That was all she had. Just a short mention, barely useful. But it lined up with the time frame they were already working with. Back at the station, the report was updated. Nothing confirmed, but the details were starting to stack. And slowly, the 1 block difference wasn't looking so small anymore. The girl's school records came in late Thursday afternoon. She hadn't officially withdrawn, but she hadn't shown up since the Monday prior, 5 days before the initial stop. No excuse note, no call from home. Just blank entries on the attendance sheet. She wasn't known to skip. Her teachers noted her as quiet but punctual. Good grades. No major disciplinary marks. But no close friends either. She kept to herself, stayed out of trouble, and rarely spoke unless prompted. When officers checked with the front office, the secretary confirmed no one had called in her absence. She hadn't picked up her last assignment packet. Her locker had been cleared out halfway. Books gone, jacket still hanging. Security footage from the school was limited. Most cameras covered entrances and main hallways, not side exits. But one recording, timestamped from the Friday before the incident, showed her stepping out the side door just after lunch. Alone. No one seemed to notice. From there, nothing. They cross-referenced the timing with city bus routes. She hadn't boarded any that passed the school. No ride shares were flagged on her family's account either. Officers checked phone records, hoping for a ping, something to show movement or communication. But the last signal from her phone had been recorded that same Friday, a few hours after she left campus. The tower hit placed her near the older part of town, close to where the suspect claimed he found her. After that, it went dark. There were no follow-up calls, no texts, no outgoing location data. The phone simply stopped broadcasting, as if shut off manually or stripped of its battery. The absence wasn't dramatic. There was no note, no confrontation, no public breakdown. She had simply stopped showing up. By the time the interview room camera clicked on, the suspect had been awake for nearly 26 hours. He looked exhausted but alert, legs crossed, hands resting quietly on the table. No cuffs, no visible injury. Just that same blood-stained shirt folded in a sealed evidence bag on the side counter. The detective didn't come in with a stack of files or dramatic questions. Just a notepad, mostly blank. He sat down, asked if the man wanted water. The man nodded. That was the only word spoken for the first few minutes. The questioning didn't start with accusations. It began with small details. How long he'd been at the warehouse. If he remembered the girl's condition. Why he didn't call anyone when he found her. He gave the same answers he'd given the first night. That he didn't know her, that she wasn't moving, that he didn't think calling would help. When asked again how the blood got on his shirt, he said she grabbed him when he tried to pull her up. He didn't know if she was conscious. He just reacted. He kept saying he didn't hurt her, that he wasn't the reason she was there. The detective didn't push hard. He let the silences hang, let the man speak. But when he brought up the timeline again, the day she was missing, the day she left school, the man blinked a little more than usual. He scratched at his wrist. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else, but he didn't. No confession came. Later that day, the lab confirmed that none of the DNA under the girl's nails matched his. No trace of him was found on the restraints. No surveillance placed him near the area until the night he called it in. Legally, there wasn't enough to hold him. They released him just after sunset. He left with no belongings except the clothes he came in with, minus the shirt. A bus ticket was offered. He declined it. He didn't ask for a ride or speak to the officer who walked him out. Just stepped into the evening air and disappeared down the street. The girl remained in protective custody. Her full statement was still pending. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't active either. It sat in the system, marked for follow-up, flagged with inconsistencies. No charges were filed. Just a report. Filed, stamped, and shelved.